it's a really good illustration of the quote that Buffett or Munger would always cite from Ben Franklin, where he said, an empty sack can't stand straight. I think it's really hard to be of service when you feel kind of empty yourself, when you're afraid that you're not going to be okay, that there's not going to be enough.
So, William, we have a lot of topics here to talk about, and as always, before we dive into the outline of our episode, we always talk about a bunch of different things going into it. And one of the first things we talked about was ego, and it ties a bit into the first topic of today, that is serving others and how we best serve others. And I personally found that one of the best ways to keep my own ego in check is by serving others. I don't know, William, you don't come across to me as a man with a big ego. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Is that something you feel you're struggling with?
I have a huge ego. Someone wrote to me this morning from Lagos, and he introduced me to someone, and he said he introduced me as someone with no ego, and I'm like, no, I didn't reply yet, but no, I think my ego is probably raging. But sorry, keep going.
I love that you said that, William, because I was like your friend. I actually meant it very sincerely, and I've known you for quite some time now. You don't come across to me like a man with a huge ego. Do you think that's the case?
It's a very complex subject. I mean, I think the ego is a tricky thing, and so I think so I'm very aware, I think, of the ways in which I can be deceiving myself. So if I start to think, oh, I'm such a righteous person, I'm overcoming my ego, and I'm so selfless, and I'm so kind and compassionate and stuff, then I'll do something, I'll behave in some way that reminds me what a schmuck I am and how much work I still have to do. And so I sometimes think that the ego just gets more cunning, so, there are really obvious ways in which we have ego when, particularly, not just when we're younger. I mean, I think about times where I had such a compulsion to say something that I knew was arrogant and ego-filled. Like if you're in a meeting with someone you want to impress, and you tell them how well your book is doing, or your podcast is doing, or how much people love you, or something someone said about you that was flattering, and you shouldn't do it. And then you're like, I just can't help myself. And so I think I've got a little bit better at not doing that. But then I think probably my ego just got kind of craftier and found other ways to express itself. So maybe then I can congratulate myself on being at a higher level, so I no longer boast about that stuff. And so then instead I'm boasting about, being at a higher level. And so my ego just tripped me up in a whole other way.
What wonderful. So the same problem, just in a different form. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, I often think that life is a bit like playing computer games, where not that I ever really played computer games, so the analogy I may get wrong, but that sense that you keep getting to a slightly higher level, where it's like, okay, you aced that level, or you muddled through that level, or whatever. So the challenges just get bigger. So I don't think there's a sense that you ever really overcome this stuff. I had a great teacher who taught me a really important lesson. Actually, long after, several years after he died, I watched a video of him speaking. It's called Rav Berg. He's the father of Michael Berg, who was a guest on the podcast. And he said something about how you always have what they would call, in certain translations from Hebrew, the evil inclination. There's always this negative desire to do stuff just for your own ego, for your own self. The question is whether you bind it or not. And I found that incredibly helpful to hear, because instead of then hoping or sort of projecting onto other people and thinking, oh, they're so superior, look how holy they are, and they're not subject to these flaws like, lust, jealousy, greed, anger. It was a reminder that, no, we're human, and so we're all vulnerable to these things. And the question is really whether you bind them or not. That was very helpful to me. Rather than deluding myself into thinking that anyone really had nailed this stuff, all falling into the trap of self-loathing and despair, because I'm like, well, how come I still have all of these things? So I don't know, that when someone who's profoundly wise like him says something like that, that no, we're always going to have this evil inclination, you just bind it. I find that incredibly clarifying. So I'm always tucking away these great insights from elders, whether it's him or Charlie Munger or Marcus Aurelius, you know, any of these people who seem to have figured something out. And then at the same time aware that they're flawed as well, that they're subject to the same human flaws that we have.
So thank you so much for sharing, William. And I wanted to go into the first topic here today, which is about serving others. And I almost feel a bit bad about going this route after you talked about Marcus Aurelius and Charlie Munger and getting enlightened. I'm going to start with McDonald's mission statement. It sounds so flat in comparison. And so I'm going to take one step back and sort of like explain why we're starting with this premise. So it really starts from this idea of serving others. And it's probably no secret that TIP is a huge part of my life. And I very much started to think more about our podcast, the other things we do here on TIP, as a way of serving others, which might sound simple, but I found it's very, very not simple. And one of the first things that came to mind was, you know, I remember when I was a student, I was in business school, and then you learn that all companies should have a mission statement. And I remember thinking, what a waste of time that was to talk about mission statements. Because to me, it didn't seem applicable at all. Of course, I was, you know, whenever I was in that age and had no life experience and whatnot, and you look differently at things. But let me just read out here McDonald's mission statement. Our mission is to make delicious, feel-good moments easy for everyone. Okay, that's it. So, I don't know if I'm going to offend anyone here working at McDonald's, but so you read that, and I don't know if anyone is any wiser. And I don't know if you work at McDonald's, if you wake up in the morning and think about that mission statement. My best guess is that it's not something that gets you out of bed. And really, this whole idea about a mission statement really felt like it was just a bunch of corporate nonsense and something that companies do because it sounds good, but not because they truly meant it. You know, you can go back and look at some of Enron's, like their mission statement, and I don't know, that didn't age well. And so, as irony, of course, would have it, now that I'm offending everyone I can here as I'm talking, I thought a lot about TIP's mission statement over the past, I don't know, 12 to 24 months. And I want to take the opportunity to discuss this with you, William, about how to best serve others and what it means for the value investing community. Because if I could take then again one step back, whenever we started TIP, Preston and I could have come up with some kind of, I don't know if it's just beautiful, but I would probably come up with a mission statement like, this is something I just typed up here. So, educate and enrich the world about investing just like Warren Buffett. Or something like that. But that was not how it happened at all. We didn't start with that mission statement. You know, Preston and I became friends, and we thought it was fun to talk about Buffett on a podcast. That was it. We didn't really go out and enrich the world. Like, there was at least I don't know, I can't speak for Preston. That was definitely not what I was thinking. And, you know, after a few years of making no money, we made just a little bit more than nothing, which is still, I should say, very little. It wasn't like it was enough by any means to sustain like a full-time salary or anything like that. But even at that time, I didn't wake up and think to myself, how do I serve others? I mean, I I kind of feel like I'm going to come across as I don't know if I'm going to come across like a bad person here, but I I had a teaching job whenever I started TIP. I loved teaching. That was also one of the reasons why I wanted to do TIP, but I wouldn't go to the local school and teach if they didn't pay me. And I don't think any of my coworkers would have done that. It was fun to teach, but I need to pay rent. And so, but whenever I started making a bit more money, it was more like, hey, can I support my family with this money? Again, I would like to say, man, if we just had this mission statement about serving others, like that would really drive me. That was not what drove me. It was, oh, I can actually do this, which I really enjoy doing, and I can support my family. And okay, so it was really only after reaching my financial goals that I started waking up thinking, purpose. Like, what's the purpose of TIP? Why do we exist? Why should we exist? And so I'm going to throw it over to you here. I kind of feel I was going out on a tangent there, William, but I wanted to hear your journey with serving others. Let me throw it back over to you there, William.
Well, I think much like you, I didn't start out with a great sense of altruism and selflessness. I think that develops more as you get older. I mean, maybe it's part of middle age that, you're still in your 30s, right? I'm in my 50s. It may be that the ego kind of quietens down a bit and you get increasingly interested in teaching and sharing ideas and stuff like that. Maybe it's an evolutionary thing. There are people who know a hell of a lot more about evolution and biology and the like than I do, but maybe it's just part of our purpose is and our wiring. We start out in the early years being motivated by this kind of young, hungry, intense desire to get ahead and prove ourselves and compete. And I was very much motivated by that for a very long time. And there's still an aspect of that's still there. I mean, if I can't I can't lie about that and deceive myself that I've risen above that. It's not nearly as intense as it used to be. But I think a lot of my desire to succeed in my 20s and 30s was driven by pretty low emotions and motivations, like wanting to prove to myself, to people who had rejected me, or, to teachers who had underestimated me, or professors who gave me bad grades, or editors who killed stories of mine, or even I mean, I think there are things like wanting to impress your parents, or wanting to prove that you're lovable, or wanting to win the girl, or prove that you're this macho provider who can succeed. And I mean, you remember there was that song from my youth, I don't know if you've heard it, where the chorus is, anger is an energy. And there is energy in these pretty selfish, self-centered, fairly low motivations. And I harnessed it a lot. I mean, a terror of failure as well. A terror of mediocrity was a huge driver for me. And then, mixed in with that was a desire to do work that was really good, and a desire to make a difference in the world. But it wasn't very pronounced. I mean, the desire to do good work was, but I think that was probably more ego-filled. It was more wanting approval, admiration, for everyone to look and say, God, he's talented. God, he's smart, or whatever. It wasn't really about service. And then I remember I was working at Time magazine, and I'd edited the Asian edition of Time, and I'd hired this amazing reporter, a guy called Aravinda Diga, who had come up to me when I was giving a talk at Columbia many, many years ago, or was on a panel at Columbia, and gave me he said to me very awkwardly, I'm a writer, and he gave me these clips from when he had been an intern at the Financial Times. And I end up looking at this stuff and I'm like, this guy's unbelievably talented. And I got him to leave Columbia and go work at the magazine that I was working at the time. And then we moved, then I got him to leave and move to Asia to work for Time magazine there. And then eventually he quit Time magazine and he wrote this book called The White Tiger. And he invited me as his +1 at the Booker Prize dinner, which is really the most important competition in, I guess, Commonwealth countries for a novelist. And so I was sitting there sort of as his date on the evening of the Booker Prize party in London. And Aravind won. And I remember this moment of just utter joy that this friend of mine who I'd sort of mentored and hired and helped over the years had won the Booker Prize and become kind of famous. And, you know, it meant, I think his book was like the fastest selling book in the first 40 years of the Booker Prize, you know, beating even people like Salman Rushdie and the like. And I remember thinking, oh, I actually have some altruism in me. Like, I actually am really happy for this friend of mine, instead of thinking, if someone else does really well, it somehow hurts me because it's a zero-sum game. And so I was probably 39, something like that then. And I remember being shocked and kind of happy and relieved at the idea that I was so happy for my friend. And so that gives you, that's a sort of marker that something was starting to shift. And I guess earlier than that, I had, you know, I have kids who are 26 and 23. So in my late 20s, I remember when my son Henry was growing up, if he got bitten by a mosquito, his body would just sort of swell up and he'd look really uncomfortable. And I remember we were living in Hong Kong. I remember, you know, being in a room with a mosquito and thinking, I hope it bites me, not Henry. And so I guess earlier on I had this sense of like, oh, okay, so I have great care for my kids and love for my kids. I'd rather suffer. You know, it's such a small example, but again, it's a marker where you're like, oh, this is one of the strange things about being a parent is you'd actually rather be the one who's bitten and suffers. Such a small example, but kind of emblematic, than have your kids suffer. So there's some sort of awakening of something where you care more about other people than just yourself when you have kids. But then when I see Aravind succeed, I'm like, okay, so it's gone like a little bit beyond just my immediate family. And then I think as you get older, maybe also if you're fortunate enough to, you know, succeed a bit or get to a point where you're a little more comfortable financially or professionally, so you're not coming from such a fearful place of lack where you think, yeah, you know, where you're so worried that if someone else does well, it's going to somehow hurt you, that there's not enough cake to go around. So that helped, I think, when I started to become more successful, that helped. But then everything kind of fell apart when I was about 40 because I was editing the European, Middle East, and African edition of Time and then got laid off during the financial crisis. So that kind of fed that sense of lack. And then I'd say sort of in my 50s, once things started to go well and my book had done well and I felt more comfortable and more secure, it was much easier to focus on serving other people. And so I think in some ways, it's a really good illustration of the quote that Buffett and Munger would always cite from Ben Franklin, where he said, an empty sack can't stand straight. And so I think it's really hard to be of service when you feel kind of empty yourself, when you're afraid that you're not going to be okay, that there's not going to be enough. And so I think that I mean, that's a slightly long-winded way of explaining an aspect of my trajectory. And then I would say one of the things that was revelatory to me that really helped me put all of this in context was I read a book called The Wisdom of Truth by a great Kabbalistic sage called Rav Yehuda Ashlag. And I mean, I've dipped into this book, you know, hundreds of times. It's a really important book to me. And he was he was one of these people who sort of saw everything, you know, and could explain things where he would just say, this is the purpose of your soul. This is the purpose of your life. This is what you're put on this earth to do. And you would look at it and you'd be like, huh, well, that's pretty clarifying. Someone like David Hawkins does the same sort of thing where he just says, this is how the world works. And, either you believe it or you don't. But with Rav Ashlag and also with Hawkins, I tend to believe their explanations. And so what Rav Ashlag explained is that there's this kind of trajectory for each of us where we start off with what he would call the desire to receive for the self alone, which is this kind of this sort of small ego that's like me, looking out for yourself. He uses the phrase selfish love, so it's like it's just wanting to be okay. It's wanting to get ahead, wanting to beat others, wanting honor, wanting respect, wanting everything for me. And then he said, gradually we're in this process where we transform that desire to receive for the self alone into the desire to receive for the sake of sharing. And this for me was very, very revelatory, right? It's a great sage sort of explaining in very clear terms that this process you're going through where you start off just looking out for yourself essentially, it's going to have to change. You're going to have to elevate yourself somehow so that you share with others more.
I had this conversation with Mohnish. It must be at least a few months ago, because I remember us talking about whether or not we would meet up in Omaha. So it would have to be before Omaha. Yes, Sherlock Holmes. That was probably it. But really, what stuck with me was so Mohnish asked me, and I said that I didn't plan to go, and also I didn't want to go, and he like I gave him like a song and a dance about it's overwhelming, 24 hours to get there, it's not really my scene, I get a bit excited around crowds, yada yada yada, and then and Mohnish said to me, that was the wrong way to think about it. Like it was, I came from like, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but it was basically coming from like this mindset of scarcity, and instead turning the tables and say that I should be going to Omaha to elevate others in the value investing community, just like the value investing community have been elevating us. And I kind of felt it was such a beautiful way of looking at something, turning something around. And I think the first thing I probably want to conclude is that Mohnish is a better person than me. But I also think he's absolutely right, because what makes you happy doesn't always make you happy while you do it. And sometimes serving others just don't fall into that bucket. And, let's say one example could be some aspects of parenting that could fall into that bucket. And if you have purpose, you can do many things that are not fun in the short term. And, it's something that I've increasingly been thinking of as I'm going through my own journey of wanting to serve others and understanding where other people are coming from. We're 6 hosts across the podcast network here by TIP, and I found that I've increasingly have been talking about how can we serve others, how can we point this podcast or newsletter or whatever it is we do, how can we point that towards more service, and that's being received in different ways, I would say. And I also think it's important to understand where the recipient is coming from. If I speak with Clay and Kyle, for example, who are also hosting this podcast, about how we've been elevated by the value investing community, and how we should make sure to elevate the community too in return, as a way of almost like a karma, like you're supposed to pay back. It makes a lot of sense to them. And it's not like they're going to say that doesn't align with my key performance indicator for my annual bonus. Like it makes sense to them, because they understand the ethos around Warren Buffett and the value investing community, and how Buffett originally learned from Benjamin Graham, and how he's learning to the next, he's teaching the next generation, and so on and so forth, and it makes them excited. And but then the other hand, a big part of our team is also in the Philippines, and I also think we need to be realistic, or I need to be realistic about whenever I talk about that purpose. I started out like from the very top about like McDonald's purpose. Like, is that something that's going to make everyone excited? So if I went to the Philippines to visit our team there, which I do from time to time, and then said, could you rally behind, like, get up early in the morning and work hard to elevate people in the value investing community? I wouldn't fault them for thinking, well, so people who are into value investing community, okay, so it's mainly relatively rich people in the West who want to accumulate skills to become even richer. Like, that's probably not like the rally cry like you're really looking for, like as a corporation. It probably doesn't sound good like when you put it on a website like McDonald's is would like, but you also have to be a bit realistic about like where are people coming from. And so perhaps then you find a different purpose, and you have to mean it. You talked about Hawkins before, like you can't fake some, like you have to be very sincere about it. But in that case, you might speak to them more about like how we're taking some of our profits and funnel into different local charities, and how we improve society a bit more to that side than perhaps saying, it's gonna sound bad, but yeah, let's make rich people richer. Like, not everyone can like rally behind that. And so and of course that's still about service and about serving others. And so I wanted to share that. I wanted to back over to you here, William.
Well, there are a few thoughts I have about that. One is just an observation about Mohnish, which I think I may have shared with you before, privately or possibly on the podcast, where I remember going to Omaha years ago, and I would sit next to I would always sit next to Mohnish and Guy Spear, who were close friends. And I remember walking out of their annual meeting, I guess at lunchtime, towards the Marriott Hotel across the way. And I remember watching Mohnish sort of swaggering out, and he's like a big kind of imposing, impressive guy. Like he's, and he's got this luxuriant mustache, and he's charismatic, and everyone wanted to see him. And it was a little bit shocking for me the first time to see that there was almost like this rock star effect. And then over the years, I would see Mohnish change in his bearing at the annual meeting. And I think I talked to him about this when I had him on my podcast, and I told him I had seen this, that we had dinner a couple of years ago on the Saturday night after the Berkshire Hathaway AGM, and I could just see that swagger had gone, and there was a kind of greater gentleness and quietness and kindness and focus on other people. And I was really struck by it. I was like, oh, this guy has changed. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, there are all of these people who come to the Berkshire Hathaway meeting and they don't have access to Warren and Charlie. And I have access to Warren and Charlie, right? He would go to, the brunch on the Sunday that they would host and stuff like that. And so he was sort of part of this inner circle, and he would go to a private dinner that Charlie had, and he'd get to see people like, Bill Gates and the like. And he said, there are all these other people who don't have access, and the closest they're going to get is to me. And if I can help them to have a really wonderful weekend, that's a great thing. And so I'm here to be in service to them. And I thought that was such a lovely thing. It showed a kind of maturing and a kindness that he was working on himself. And I found that very inspiring. And I don't know. I think that was partly the influence of seeing Warren and Charlie and seeing how they served others as well. That they were there, these guys who just spent an enormous amount of time sharing their ideas in a generous, selfless way. And so that had a knock-on effect. It influenced Mohnish to do the same. And Monish's behavior makes you go strong. When you see someone behave like that, it makes you go strong in David Hawkins' terms. And you're like, oh, I want more of that. I want to be more like that as well. So I don't know. I think there's something kind of lovely about seeing the trajectory of these very successful people and seeing them continue to work on themselves. And then in Monish's case, again, I mean, maybe it does get back to that Franklin observation about how an empty sack can't stand straight, that because Mohnish had kind of won the game, he'd become very wealthy. You know, he'd become a sort of mentee of Charlie Munger's and stuff. And he had this amazing charitable foundation, Dakshana, that lifts thousands of people out of poverty. He was coming from a place of abundance. And so he felt good about himself. And so he could share. But it's also complicated. He'd also gone through a painful divorce and the like. So maybe his ego had been crushed a bit. And so there's also, you know, your ego does get crushed. And at the same time, you sort of elevate a bit and you learn from other people who are good role models about what works, and you try to become less selfish, I think. And so he's been a great example. Like, watching his trajectory has been great. And this is one of the reasons why it's fun to sort of keep coming back to the same people. You know, like I interviewed Mohnish years and years ago in California, and then I traveled with him for 5 days in India for the book, and then to keep coming back to see him in Omaha and see the way he's changing. It's been really, really inspiring and sort of, I don't know, kind of impressive. I'm wondering, Stig, I keep wanting to ask you, and I know you've talked about this before, but I don't think you've ever talked to me about it explicitly. I remember that you ended up investing with Mohnish, and that, you know, of all the people you've had on the podcast, he's the one you ended up investing with. And I'm just wondering what it is about him, both as an investor, but also as a person, that in a sense made you go strong, that made you want to be in his orbit.
That's a big question, William. But I'll be happy to share. So I think that track record is one. You have to show a good track record over a period of time, preferably at least 2 decades. He runs a pretty concentrated portfolio, typically 10 names. I know I come across as very mechanical, whereas you might come at a different angle. But I came from a perspective of we all shape by our experiences, and I've heard people also here on the podcast say that they're concentrated investors and they have 40 positions or 80 positions. And so I think concentration is different for everyone. I own 5 stocks, and I sometimes feel I'm a bit too diversified. So it very much depends on like how you're looking at this. And so I wanted to invest with someone who were quote unquote concentrated, because I wanted the access to the best ideas, not to the 80th best idea. And I wanted to hedge against myself. We started talking about ego. It doesn't come easy to me, I think, naturally, to have a small ego. But I think life has made me humble so many times that it's gotten a little easier with every passing year. And so I like to think that I like to think that I'm right about my investments. I could be wrong about all 5 stocks in my portfolio, and I like to hedge against myself by investing with someone else. And I think that there's an element of, if we ran this experiment 1,000 times, I think that Mohnish's track record would be better than mine, and I think you would have to look through that lens as well. I should say, for the record, I think Mohnish is a wonderful human being, but I don't think I put a huge emphasis on that whenever I chose an asset manager, and I only chose one. Now, it was very important to me that the asset manager couldn't be a terrible person. But I think, like, if I could invest with an asset manager that was like a 10 out of 10 on a personality value scale, but a subpar investor compared to being 8 out of 10 on wonderful values, I think I would probably have gone the better investor route, even though that probably doesn't reflect well on me. And then I think there was also just staying in the whole value investing community thing. I like to think that I would be able to sniff out with if, quote unquote, Mohnish lost it. And I don't know how to best quantify that. I before been invested in stocks that was clearly outside my circle of competence. I couldn't see it was outside of my circle of competence because I didn't understand it well enough. But I think I understand what Mohnish is doing well enough to see if he doesn't have it anymore, which I think is a very important component of any investment thesis. So that was the short version, believe it or not, William.
How do you get started with stock investing? I've put together a course to teach you everything I wish I knew when I first started investing in stocks. Let's start at the beginning and ask, what is a stock? Let's zoom on into what it's actually like to buy a stock. A few options are Charles Schwab, TD Ameritrade, Ally, E-Trade. Fortunately, you won't have to necessarily calculate all of these taxes yourself. I'll outline a few main ones to be aware of throughout your lifetime investing journey. As Warren Buffett says, your best investment is yourself. There's nothing that compares to it. By the end, you'll be savvier about stock investing and personal finance than the vast majority of people. Even if you're not a total beginner, I'm confident you'll get a lot out of the principles and strategies I outline, which we'll build on throughout. Link to the course is available in the description below. See you there.
No, it's very interesting. And I think it's helpful to people to hear your thought process about these things. I have a slightly, I don't know if it's irrational or if it's intuitive or whatever, but I have a different set of filters in addition, I think, to that. And so the people I've ended up investing with on the whole are very, very concentrated and very patient. And they're very much in the Munger school of spear fishermen, of waiting patiently for a mispriced bet, then grabbing that opportunity with what Munger called gumption, and then going back to sitting on their hands for a long time, just reading, studying other ideas and not doing anything. So I have the same kind of philosophy as you, I think, in that sense of liking people who understand that they can't know that much about that many things. So they've got to be concentrated for the most part. Although there are different ways of winning the game, obviously, many different ways of winning the game. But that one sort of suits me temperamentally and intellectually. But then I also really think about, do I want that person in my life? Does this manager seem like someone I actually want in my life? And I give a really, I think probably an unusual amount of weight to that. And so, I don't know. I mean, I'm always a bit reticent to talk about people I've invested with because I don't want it to seem like an endorsement or anything and lead people astray. But like I invested with Chris Begg, for example, who I had as a guest on the podcast. He has a very concentrated portfolio and he's very smart. And he's not asset gathering. But I also just really like him. I think he's, and I'm also aware of the fact that my judgment can be poor. So I diversify. Again, I'm hedging against myself. So if I'm wrong in one bet, it's not going to sink me, God forbid. But also, I want to spend more time with Chris. I really like him. I went to see him in Costa Rica and spent time with him in Costa Rica, and I'll go see him. I met him in New York, and I'll go see him in Massachusetts, where he has a home. So part of it is actually seeing people who I want in my life. Same with my friend Josh Tarasoff, who I ended up investing with years ago, who also runs a concentrated portfolio. But it's just like a very calm, decent, honorable person. And so I don't know that. So the quality of the human being matters a great deal to me. And then at the same time, I'm also aware that one of my behavioral flaws or vulnerabilities is that I look for the best in people. And that makes me extremely vulnerable to making poor judgments of people's character. And so I have to be careful about the risk of projecting onto a fund manager qualities that I wish they had, that maybe are my own self-delusion. But so despite that caveat and that reticence, that distrust of my own judgment, I take really seriously that idea of I'm almost collecting people, not funds. And I only have a small number, but they're people that I trust, and you can see it with their fee structure. You can see it from their habits. You can see it from what they read. You can see it from who they hang out with. And if there's someone who is like really good at making money, but kind of an arse, I actually just wouldn't want them in my life. I wouldn't want them in my portfolio.
I love that you say that, William, and I have a story to that. So this was something that happened to me here recently, and this is the ego talking again now. So please bear with me, William. So I sometimes get offers in terms of people wanting to invest with me. And I always say no. And I could make significantly more money managing assets than running TIP. And I'm pretty sure I would have jumped at the chance 10 years ago if someone would. But as irony would have it, whenever no one knows you and you don't have a track record, no one wants to invest with you. So your opportunity set, of course, also changes. And so, and I felt like I was a little lost, especially earlier this year. And I found it to some extent to be a bit tempting to take some of that money and perhaps manage money. Of course, when I say take money, it's not like no one, it's not free money, because it comes with a lot of constraints. Like the life I have here running TIP is a wonderful, wonderful life. And yes, it's not because it's all roses and rainbows, not like that, but you have a lot of freedom. There's other good things. So anyways, I felt that I was a place in my life earlier this year where I could choose the money route and not like my life that much, or I could continue with TIP, make significantly less money, but don't feel sorry for me. I have enough money, quote unquote, for the rest of my life. Put it into that what you want to. So it's not like anyone should feel sorry for me, but I don't have like extravagant amount of money, but enough to do what I want to do. And I was a bit more tempted than I wanted to admit in terms of taking the money. And so what happened to me here recently was that I was doing business with someone. It's not someone who's part of TIP, and I don't want to mention his name because I don't think nothing good would come out of that. But it was like it was a business relationship where I felt that it perhaps wasn't a win-win. And I had a conversation with him about it. He didn't really understand where I was coming from. And I was kind of like worried about telling him what I'm telling you now, William, and the rest of the world. It was like I could choose like the money and hate my life, or I could choose to work with TIP and not make as much money. but still decent money. And since I've done that, I only want good relationships in my life. And he looked at me and he was like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he was like, life is a grind. It's tough. You have to make money and you have to pay rent, and then you hustle and perhaps you lie a bit and you try to. It's like, no. Like, what? Like, what are you telling me? And so it would be easy for me to judge that person and say, you have flawed values. But I also think starting here at the very top of our conversation here, William, and talking about our own journey, about service, it's easy to have principles whenever you can afford them. Like, it's easy to say, no, I don't need, let me just use generic number. I don't need $3 million a year. I can get by with $500,000 a year. Poor me. And then someone out there's like, yeah, but if you're making $500,000, like, it's the same as 3 million. But it's not necessarily the same if you make $500,000. And it's gonna, obviously these generic numbers, and it's gonna make me sound like a bit of a jerk. But I think I think there's something to be said about, like, you're changing your opportunity set all the time, and you're meeting other people who have different experiences and therefore see things a different way. And don't judge others if they feel that if they don't have the I don't know what the word I'm looking for here. Don't judge others if you feel that they have flawed principles. But perhaps, to your point, William, don't have it in your don't have those people in your orbit.
Yeah, I think you've got to be very careful about who you have in your ecosystem, because if we go back to that insight that we talked about before, which is that we all have ego, we all have the, I don't really like the words, but it translates as the evil inclination. We all have this desire to do lousy stuff. The question is, how do you bind it? And so if you put yourself in an environment where you're surrounded by really good people, you're less likely to give strength to the part of yourself that's a little bit more base and a little bit self-interested and a little bit more morally flexible. And likewise, you think of Buffett talking about how he never wanted to get in debt because he didn't want to see what he was capable of. And so I think to put yourself in a situation where you're not overreaching financially, you live within your means, you don't take on a ridiculous amount of debt, so you don't have to you don't have to be tempted to do things that maybe are unethical or that you would be ashamed of later, or that require a compromise in your values. I worked on one book project, you and I have talked about this before, where I had a feud with the guy who had hired me to do it. I just really disliked him. And he sort of threatened me at one point financially. And Mohnish said to me, if you had had more money, you would have told him in, using expletives in the way that Mohnish would, you would have told him where to go. And in fact, it turned out to be an amazing project for me in many ways. And I'm glad that I stuck with it and that I didn't tell him where to go. But it's true that if I had had more money at the time, and I had kids in private school and I had very expensive rent and stuff like that, and I was sort of still rebuilding from that period after the financial crisis when I'd lost my job as an editor and the like, I don't know, I would at least have had the choice to get this guy out of my life. And I've not really talked to him since. I've thanked him for the fact that actually he was a good force in my life and he helped to put me on a good path in certain ways. The people who've treated me really decently and really kindly, I keep going back to those people. It's like Munger talking about the seamless web of deserved trust. When you find people who just behave really well and who look out for your best interests and who you trust and who are really high quality people, like, why would I want my ecosystem to have lower quality people? And that sounds like really judgmental, and it's not really meant to be. It's bad term to say lower quality, because again, there's a really beautiful insight from Rav Ashai, who I quoted before, who said, we're all like unripened fruit. And so we're just at different stages in our ripeness, and we're all ripening. I mean, I don't think I was a terrible human being in my early years of my career for wanting to get ahead and prove myself and work hard and get financial stability and be able to support my young children and the like. You know, I was looking out for myself and my family. I wasn't a terrible human being, but there was an element of unripeness. And now in my 50s, there's an element of unripeness. And I hope, 20 years from now, I'll look back and be like, wow, I'm a much kinder and more decent human being. And I've bound that much more of my own ego and negativity.
William, I'd like to continue talking a bit more about this idea of serving others. And as the listeners can probably tell by now, I'm definitely a work in progress. So this is going to be my disclaimer and my excuse. So before your flight takes off, you're told that in case of emergency, you're supposed to put on your oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your child or whoever's sitting next to you. And I think that's such a beautiful metaphor for so many things in life, whether it's diet or any of your of your relationship that comes to mind. And I feel so privileged and lucky to be hosting this show, and I would like to say it's because of me, and I'm just super smart that we now crossed 170 million. I think you'll probably find that most of the growth we had was after I sort of like left the microphone, and we teamed up with William and other hosts instead. But and I should also just make this disclaimer: we're super lucky to be starting in 2014. We would have setting up the same show today would give us close to 0 listeners compared to what it used to. But reaching so many people as we have, I found it to be, ironically, I found it harder to build relationships. It was actually very easy in the beginning, because whenever you have like tens and tens of listeners, you get so excited about people emailing you, and you're like, oh, let's jump on a call. Let's like, you're a new best friend. But I get thousands of emails, and this is me, this is probably me complaining. It doesn't sound nice. But I think it's tricky. I remember whenever I was a kid and there was someone that I looked up to and someone I wanted to get in contact with, and how much it hurt if they ignored me. And I really don't want to ignore people. And so it might be like, how do you respond to 1,000 emails? Yes, there is, of course, and there's an element of delegation, and some people on the team are much better with emails than I am. But I also wanted to mention our mastermind community and what a gift it has been for us, but also that there's I think that there is element of guilt there. I wanted to talk a bit about. So one of the wonderful things in life is to build relationships, and it's hard to build relationships with 1,000 people at the same time. What I really like about a mastermind community is the ability to meet up in person, away from the crowds, for my benefit. But meet up in person, but also we mainly like meet virtually, but you meet the same people week after week and month after month, so you get to know people. And it's a small community, that in our mastermind community. So by definition, you don't get to serve as many others. You don't get to serve as many as you would if it's on a podcast and it goes out to 170 million or whatever it is. But you can also serve them better because you get to know them in a different way. That's going to be my disclaimer to do that. And I don't know how to solve that. I think for me, to some extent, the mastermind community that we have here has been a bit of an oxygen mask for me. And I should say the biggest oxygen mask that I have on has been the relationship with the other members of the team. Because I feel I get energized by building these deep relationships with people who share the same values. Whereas I get flustered whenever I go to these places and there are like thousands of people and everyone is like going around for 2 seconds and hi, who are you? Like I can't do that. And so, but then the other end of the spectrum, if I would sit at home, just speak into a microphone and I don't get to engage with other people than through email. I also think I could feel like some time ago that it drained me and it didn't put me in a good state to be that removed from other people. And so, William, I actually this was one very long handoff to you, because I know you have something that you're working on outside of the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast that you call Richer, Wiser, Happier Masterclass. And I think I wanted to approach that from the angle of how does that speak into this idea of serving others, and how do you struggle with this where you don't serve as many people? It's going to be a small group, just like what I mentioned before, but you also build deeper relationships, but then you're also kind of excluding all the people who could be getting some of that content and learn from that content. How do you give me the equation, William? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask you.
Yeah, I think a lot about this conflict that on the one hand, you want to reach a very large number of people because there's someone out there in the middle of nowhere who's going to hear something and it's going to affect them in some amazing way. And on the other hand, you want to have good face-to-face, rich relationships with people who, you can hear about their issues, what they're working with, and you can really help them. And so this isn't an either or, it's a yes and. You want both. You want to go wide and you want to go deep. And so the podcast is a beautiful way to go wide. I mean, I had a lovely lunch a couple of weeks ago with a doctor who'd written to me multiple times to ask to meet. He's a fan of the podcast and the book, and I, I'm always distracted and juggling too much. But I was like, actually, as it happens, tomorrow I can meet for lunch in the city, Saturday afternoon, and we went out for a really nice lunch. And he told me that there was something, I guess it was in an episode where I was talking about Mohnish, and I did this long riff about the most important lessons I'd learned from David Hawkins. And I mentioned a book that has a couple of pages. I think it's called Transcending the Ladder of Consciousness or something like that. And this guy had got that book and it had really changed his life. Like that's the most wonderful thing, right? To have this sense that there's someone out there who's heard something and he's acted on it, and that's actually had a really profound effect. And it had affected his marriage, which had been going through a difficult period, and it had really helped him get back on track. And he's a very high quality, really kind of special guy. And so to feel like the podcast can reach someone like that, who I never even knew existed until we happened to have lunch, that's a very beautiful thing. I love that. But so the thing that you and I have been discussing is, how do you go in the opposite direction and not just have that broad reach, but how do you actually, in a way, create these concentric circles where you have that very broad circle, but then you have this sort of more intimate circle where there's a handful of people that you meet and you talk to about these ideas. And so the thing that I ended up deciding I wanted to do, that I guess I started talking to you about, and you initially were skeptical, and then you were like, actually, that's a really good idea. Maybe we should do this. So that you and I think this is always the way. I think you always start skeptical, and then I wonder if I'm onto a stupid idea. And then you're like, no, actually, this is great. We should do this. So the thing we decided that we wanted to create is a richer, wiser, happier masterclass that is really intimate. And so the plan that I've hatched, and I'm very open to hearing what people would find helpful, because it's at a very early stage, but it's going to happen, and I'm really excited about it. It's basically to have a minimum of about 10 people and a maximum of 20, possibly 22. 22 is a good number. And it would be a year-long journey where we would have discussions about the book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, and the topics that I explored in the book and how I've continued to think about them and build on them because of the podcast and other things that I've been reading and thinking about and studying. And so because the book, I think, is an introduction and then 8 chapters and then an epilogue, so 10 different sections, I figured what I would do to keep it simple is to have 10 Zoom sessions over the course of a year that are probably, 90 minutes to 120 minutes each, where we would, the 10 people or the 20 people would get on a Zoom call. I would talk about some of these themes and then we'd discuss them, and I'd be open to questions. And in addition to that, there's going to be a book launch for the paperback edition of the book on January 7th. So I was thinking, okay, so I'll have a day in New York on January 7th where people come have lunch with me who are in that master class, and then I'll invite them to the book launch party that evening that probably is going to be in a fancy private club like the Racket and Tennis Club of New York, which is actually where I first became friends with Guy Spear. And then also we would do what Clay and I hosted this wonderful Jeffersonian dinner on the night of the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in Omaha. Jeffersonian dinner is something where you just have one conversation. All of you are just having one conversation. So there are no side conversations. So you're all involved in the same conversation. So the other aspect of this masterclass is that we'll have a dinner like that on the night of the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. So I guess that's 12 different contacts over the course of a year with a small group of really high quality, really interesting kind of passionate investors, learners, people who are interested in the book, in the podcast, in the ideas that we're exploring, people who are interested in how to become, not just richer, but wiser and happier. And it's a really interesting experiment to me. And, to give a sense of how I've been thinking about this, one of the things that I initially said to Stig is, should I also have a private call with each of those people? And Stig was like, well, that'll get out of hand because, everyone will want to talk for like 2 hours and it'll become unbearable for you and it'll just be too much. And then as I'm driving in this morning to my office to record this, I'm thinking, well, actually, I would kind of like to have a private call with each of those people because, this is a journey over, not for 2 hours, which would be unmanageable for me, but it is a journey over the course of a year. And the reason it appeals to me is you do have the capacity to change your life in there, to actually help people in this very personal way. And I sort of feel, I don't know, that to me is a kind of beautiful thing, that process of learning together, discussing things together, being on an intellectual journey together, but that also in some ways is a spiritual journey because you're all kind of figuring out how to live. How do we live better? How do we make sense of our lives? How do we help each other? That's a beautiful process to me, and so that's why the idea appeals to me so much. And it's an experiment. Initially Stig and I were talking about maybe we do it twice a year. We jam it in over 2 or 3 months. I'm like, no, I actually, I'm too scattered. I'm doing too many things, juggling too many things. And as Stig said, plan one, not kill William. But also I want it to stretch out over a year. So it's more of a journey. So I'm sort of thinking, maybe I should do this once and never again. And it's just an experiment. Or maybe it turns out to be a really fun and interesting thing that really helps people, and we do it more than once. And so I didn't mean this to sound like an ad for it, and I hope it doesn't come across that way. But if it appeals to anyone out there, and I've only really talked about it with friends so far. So there are several friends who are like, yeah, I want to do it. And they're really interesting people. I mean, you know, money managers and professional gamblers and the like, and you know, like serious, interesting people. But if you're interested, I think, am I right, Stig, that the best thing is probably to write to Kyle Grieve, our co-host, who's in charge of the logistics, because if I plan it, it will happen in about 2083. Where so Kyle is, I think it's Kyle, Kyle, at theinvestorspodcast.com. But if the basic plan is to start probably at the start of November, given my schedule, and then it would be roughly, you know, once a month, a call over Zoom, the meeting in New York on January 7th for lunch and dinner, and you know, this launch party for the book. Then in Omaha for the annual meeting, and just continuing on this journey over the year. So I don't know. I hope people are interested in it. If it's fewer than 10 people, I won't do it. But we're also going to cap it at 20, 22 or something. So it is a sort of intimate, special kind of one-off thing.
Wonderful, William. Thank you for sharing. And I wanted to continue this this conversation about building relationships. Every time I speak to you, I feel like I learn something new, and I think you were wonderful at building relationships. I should say, start right out of the gates, William. And I remember this was probably a few years ago, and so I think we originally got introduced. I think it was Guy who introduced us back in 2015 or something. Whenever you published your other book, but
yeah, The Great Minds Investing.
Great Minds Investing. Yeah,
2015, I think it was.
Must be.
I was one of the guests on your podcast back when you had about 12 listeners.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you, William. Yeah.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. But you know, I remember whenever we started working together, like more formally, like a few years ago, I want to say, and I remember you said to me at the time, which I was originally a bit confused about. You said, "Oh, we should probably like chat once a month," and I was a bit confused because my first thought is, what should we talk about? And you know, I think one of my strengths, but certainly also my weakness, it's very often comes in pair. Like I'm very mechanical. I'm just wired that way. And so, for example, William, we talked previously about how we read books, and I just read cover to cover. It's very difficult for me not to read cover to cover. I know, like you're much better than me. You can stop reading books and you can go back and forth and all of that. And I go the same way. And so I would go into every meeting I have with an agenda, and not in the Machiavellian way of like, hey, I have an agenda of like angle shooting you. Like, no, that's not my part. But like, I would even this interview, but this conversation, but I would go and be like, okay, so we have so and so many bullet points, and then we have sub bullet points, and then we have takeaways. Like, I'm wired that way. I can't read a book without having like a note system with 3 different indexes, and it's absolutely terrible. But for whatever reason, it makes sense to me. And so, whenever you mentioned this to me, William, I remember I was confused because I've noticed that others sometimes say, you know, let's just stay in touch, and then typically what happens is that you never hear that person again. Perhaps they're just trying to be nice, but you mention it so many times, and then you stopped, which was my hint of I'm probably just not that interesting to speak to. But I wanted to William, I wanted to open up a conversation with you about how you form relationships, how you go into a call with an agenda, not to have an agenda, and then at the same time you also want to live a life of subtraction, but then you also want to build beautiful relationships. And so, how do you juggle all of that? Yes.
I juggle it really badly. I mean, one of the things that happens is that I have this fantasy of a simple, easy, calm life of subtraction where I've reduced all of the complexity, and I write about this in Richer, Wiser, Happier. I talk about it on the podcast. I talk about it in speeches. And then there's like this cosmic joke that I keep adding new layers of complexity. And so, for example, I mean, a few weeks ago, after we had talked about setting up the masterclass, I was thinking, well, it's insane. Why would I add yet another layer of complexity to my life? Because everything I do, I'm obsessive, and I'm sort of fanatical, and I want it to be great and to add a lot of value. And then we decide, okay, so we shouldn't have those individual phone calls with the people in the masterclass, because that will add yet another layer of complexity and make my life that much more crazy. And then I'm like, yeah, but I want to add more value to those people and really have an impact. So I should do it. And if that's my instinct to give them more value and to help more, I should trust that and I should do it. So I'm constantly caught up in this conflict between this fantasy of wanting a simple, clean, calm life and the reality, which is I keep adding more complexity to my life. And one of the challenges with this is that I'm not very linear. I'm not very structured. And so my approach, which has sort of worked for me over the years, is in a kind of sequential way to deal with one project or one deadline at a time in a maniacal way. So I surround the topic, whether it's that I'm going to interview someone, or I'm preparing for a speech, or for a masterclass, or editing something or writing something. I'm maniacally focused on it. So it's almost like this spotlight, this floodlight, focuses on that. And then I bring that thing to fruition, or at least as close as I can. Maybe I finish editing a chapter and then I start preparing for a podcast episode or a conversation with you, and then I move on to something else. And that sort of works for me. But it's quite a stressful way to live, because I'm also traditionally always harnessing my anxiety and my fear of failure and my fear of doing something mediocre. So it's often not very joyful because I'm so busy being maniacal in my preparation for everything. But it's sort of worked. But I'm trying to evolve and update that strategy. So I'm still being a maniac in the intensity with which I prepare for everything and work on everything and try to make everything good. But I'm trying to be more joyful about it. And so to have the intensity of the commitment to quality, but without the worry and the self-recrimination and the self-flagellation about missing deadlines or being behind or not being able to juggle everything. So I'm really struggling with this stuff. So I don't want to in any way give the impression that I've nailed this and I'm on top of it all. But one of the things that I'm very conscious of is really to think about, what am I optimizing for? And so I think about, well, the masterclass sort of gets through the filter of what I should or shouldn't be doing, because I have an opportunity to have an impact on people's lives. I have an opportunity to talk about books, to talk about ideas, to share ideas, to help other people. That's very central to what I perceive as the purpose of my life. But then one of the things that I started yeah, and so I'm fairly ruthless about turning down things that don't really work for me. So people are often writing to me and say, I mean, literally this morning I had someone write to me and say, could you edit, this book for this person? And I'm like, no. I keep passing things like that off to other people, even though it might be kind of lucrative, because it's just not what I want to do. But I am at the moment editing a different book that's with a close friend of mine, because I'm learning a great deal from the book, and he's someone I love, and I get to spend time with him and learn from him. And I'll have him as a guest on the podcast down the road. And so I don't know, I have this general sense of what it is I'm optimizing for, what's important. And then I try to remove the other stuff, but I'm failing at it the whole time. I'm constantly adding complexity. But I guess one thing that I did realize very, very vividly in the last year or so was that I'd been neglecting my friendships. I'd been neglecting relationships, and I needed to make sure that I was feeding that part of my life. And so part of what's added to the complexity of my life is that I've tried to spend more time with friends. I spend a lot of time with family. But so things like going to Costa Rica to see Chris Begg, it's kind of a crazy thing to do, but I hadn't taken a vacation in ages, and I went with my wife, and I spent some time with this really nice guy who I hadn't spent much time with. I mean, he'd been on the podcast, and I met him two or three times before. So to go spend 9 days at a hotel that he and his wife have in Costa Rica was a pretty big thing to do for me. Similarly, I recently started to have these calls every few months to discuss Proust, my favorite novelist, with Pico Iyer, who was a guest on the podcast, who's brilliant and who I like tremendously. And he lives in Japan. And so to have the opportunity to talk to someone like that is really valuable to me. And so I love Proust. I love talking about fiction. Proust is incredibly profound on multiple levels. But also it's an opportunity to build my friendship with Pico, who I love, who's just a really wise, decent, lovely, brilliant guy. He was an amazing guest on the podcast. It's one of my favorite episodes. And, Pico was close to Leonard Cohen and has known the Dalai Lama really well since he was a teenager. And, for me to get to, and Pico came off this class at Oxford in English literature, and to get to talk about books and build that friendship is really important. So to try to structure that regularly is important. And likewise, every Friday morning, I have a conversation over Zoom with 3 friends. Sometimes only 2 of them show up. They're 3 very successful money managers who are all students of a particular great Tibetan Buddhist teacher. And we talk about our lives, and we talk about our meditation practice, and we help each other, and we support each other. And that ends up being about an hour and a half every Friday morning. And sometimes we meet at 7:30 in the morning, and sometimes otherwise 8. It's a really big commitment, but they're very extraordinary people. And one of them is Yen Liao, who a lot of our investment audience will know is great. I mean, just an extraordinary mind, utterly brilliant guy. And, if you have the opportunity to speak to Yen Liao 3 or 4 times a month, that's a really rich thing to do. One of them's a senior partner at a major private equity firm. One of them is the guy I share my office with, a really special guy, whose book I'm editing at the moment. And, so I think one of the things that's shown to me that would have terrified me, the idea of structuring that into my life, this huge commitment, really an hour and a half that sometimes turns into 2 hours on a Friday morning, every Friday. That's like way too much. But actually it's turned out to be a very precious thing. And the others are incredibly busy as well. And it's turned out to be almost like this sort of sacred space. And so I think, one of the things Yen often talks about, because Yen is even more linear than you. I mean, Yen has this incredible ability to design systems. And so he'll talk about the importance of structuring things into your day, into your week, you know, that these structures trump any intentions. You know, you've got to actually structure it in. So I think if there's anything kind of practical to take away from this, I think you want to figure out what you're optimizing for, and then try to figure out a way actually to structure it into your life. And so if you and I, you and I don't really need to chat once a month, and maybe it would be a waste of time for you. But there's also a sense that if you have regular conversations with something, the spotlight will be there. You'll be deeply present, and things will come up. And I've often tried to do this with Guy Spear, to schedule something once a month, and I just don't think he sees the value in it and is too distracted. And so we've never done it regularly. And so like a couple of weeks ago, we talked briefly and we were like, let's have a proper talk tomorrow. And then of course we didn't. And so I think that's the problem. If you don't structure it in, those conversations aren't going to happen. And then there are things where you could bring a great deal of value to that person by simply being present and talking about what's on their mind. And so this commitment to what I'm doing every Friday morning has actually reinforced my belief that if something is valuable to you, if you want to spend time with people regularly, structure it in. And particularly this idea that I think I've talked about before to you, this phrase that I learned from my friend Matt Ludmer, who's one of the three people I meet with on Friday mornings. He talks about this image of friends along the path. And if you find friends along the path who can really support your own progress, your own development, your own process of continuous learning, that is such an unbelievably powerful thing. And so in some ways, what I'm doing by setting up the Richer, Wiser Masterclass is creating another container of friends along the path. So it's not me saying, oh, look, I'm the teacher, I'm better, I'm smarter than you guys. Not at all. It's like, it's friends along the path who are exploring ideas together. And you know, if you can lift up other people in some way as part of that process, that's an amazing thing. But also at the same time, you're forced actually to internalize these ideas and to study them yourself and to figure out what you think so that you can explain it to other people, which is one of the reasons why Munger said to talk to Mohnish about this, right? When Guy, I've told you this before, I think, where Guy said to Guy was introduced to Munger by Mohnish, and Guy said, yeah, Mohnish was like, yeah, this is the guy who I discuss all of my investment ideas with. And Guy said something self-deprecating, like, you know, you might as well talk to a monkey. I don't know why he bothers to talk to me because he's so much smarter. And Munger said, no, a monkey wouldn't work because Mohnish would know that it's a monkey. And so Munger's belief is that, you know, what he was trying to explain there is that to have a talking partner is an amazing mechanism for learning because you're going to have to articulate your own views. And that's going to teach you and is going to help you to progress as well. So that's what I'm trying to structure into my life, is this process where I'm surrounded by friends along the path who are decent, kind, continuous learners who come at life with a very generous mindset where they're trying to help each other. And so part of what's difficult here is that it's not a very linear process. It's not a very directed process where you know that you're going to get a particular return. What you're doing is creating this container for a certain type of magic to happen. And that's a little harder for you because it's so nebulous. There's no agenda. But it's okay for me because I'm not very linear. And I have this confidence that if I'm there with really cool people who are really smart, something is going to come up because the spotlight is going to be flashing in that area, and we might have the opportunity to learn something beautiful.
So, William, I can't help but ask, whenever I'm listening to how you're forming these deep relationships, you have a big voice in the value investing community, and you reach a lot of people. How do you think about spending your time to serve the value investing community or society in general? Now I'm very much like going like in 12,000 foot view here, but so for example, whenever I had this conversation with Mohnish and we talked about, we should probably sometimes do something we don't always enjoy, the practical man in me said, well, instead of going to something that's not really my scene, why don't I hire someone who feels like being paid to go to Omaha is the best thing in the world and who would actually enjoy it way more than me? And then everybody wins. And then I can do something else that's a little more me. Which is probably not the right way to think about it. How do you think about forming these very deep relationships? And some of the people you refer to here are, not all of them, very, very successful. It doesn't have to be financial success. That's not what I'm talking about. But they're very, very successful in what they do. And you perhaps enjoy those relationships more than using your platform to speak to 100,000 people at the same time, which might not be as joyful, but you're paying more back to society. How do you square those two?
There's this great irony, right? That on the one hand, I'm writing about and interviewing the world's most rational people. And on the other hand, I find myself becoming more and more intuitive about every decision I make. And I'm not recommending this to other people, but I put myself in certain situations because it feels right to me in some way. So I'm not really doing it in a very calculated way. When I think about something like the Masterclass, I'm thinking, maybe there's someone in that group whose life I could change. Maybe it's just one person, I don't know. And I remember there's a beautiful teaching from this guy, the Baal Shem Tov, who said that you could be incarnated in a body for whatever it was, 80 years or something like that, just to do one material favor to one person. And he said you could miss it. You could be here for a whole lifetime just to help one person. I love that phrase. It's one material favor for one person. And so I often put myself in positions because I'm like, what if this is the moment? What if this is the person who I'm here to help? And I obviously can't do that with everyone, and I can't, and life becomes kind of intolerable because there are times where I'm like so thin stretched that I'm making problems for everyone because I become unreliable because I'm doing too many things. And I do this often with your lovely team in the Philippines, who are quietly waiting for me to edit an episode that was due the other day. And it's like, it's hard for me. I always feel like I'm letting people down because I'm juggling too much. But then on the other hand, I do have this sense of like, yeah, what if this is the person? What if I need to meet this person, or what if I need to be in this place for this reason at this moment? And I did have an extraordinary thing a few years ago that I'll mention very briefly, where I was in this town next to me in Westchester, New York, and with my kids, and someone pulled out of a parking space in front of us, like sort of tore out of this parking space really fast. And my son and daughter and I were in the car, and we look down and we see that there's a phone on the street. And we think, well, it's probably from this woman who tore out of this space really fast. And we pick up the phone, and it hadn't, it was still unlocked. And so we called the last person who she texted, and I talked to that person. And that person said to me, yeah, this woman who dropped the phone, she lives just across the street from where you were. And I went with my kids and we put the phone in her mailbox. And then we went home and we had a dinner. I think it was a Friday night dinner. So we had a kind of shove-up dinner with the family, which was kind of really joyful and lovely. And then a few hours later, I get a call from this stranger whose phone it was I picked up. And she said, you don't understand. If you hadn't returned my phone, I would have jumped off the Tappan Zee Bridge that night. Because she'd had a series of terrible things happen to her. I think she'd lost her job and she had health issues and the like, and all of her contacts were in the phone and it wasn't backed up. And she and I have actually remained friends. And she's been very supportive to me at times. It's kind of an amazing person. And I think of her pretty much every day, even though I don't talk to her that often. And so just that, and during COVID, there was a moment where she said to me, she was helping all of these old people. And she said to me, no, you don't understand how many people I, as in she, was helping. She's like, I think I was very late on my deadline for my book and I was tormenting myself and I felt terrible. And she's like, no, you saved my life. And here I am helping all of these people. That's much more important than your deadline. And so I think that sort of thing makes me kind of mystical or sentimental about these things. I'm just like, I want to be not so linear and so logical and so rational that I miss the opportunity to be, available to these strange things that come up out of nowhere.
I can't find a better way to end this conversation, William, than what you just said. Any concluding remarks? That was absolutely beautiful.
No, I'm just grateful that we get to talk about these things, and it's, yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about these things because there's a part of me that wants to censor myself and not, not sound too crazy, and there's a part of me that's like, well, no, I have to try to be honest and have to try to be authentic and have to try to share, what it is I've figured out, whether it's right or wrong. And a lot of it is very idiosyncratic and it's not for everyone. But this is my attempt to make sense of my life and to figure out how to live. And I'm just, so if I can share some of these stories and insights that have helped me make sense of it, my hope is there's someone out there that's like, yeah, no, that works for me. And it'll change the way they behave. And if it helps them, that's a really beautiful thing.
Well said, William. Thank you as always for making time, and it's always a pleasure speaking with you. I always learn so much. So what can I say other than just say thank you?
Thank you, Stig. Thanks for creating this this particular container. It's great that we have this regular opportunity to chat.
Yeah, that's the irony of things, William, where we have this very structured way of being unstructured. So perhaps we meet each other midway there.
Yeah, it's a good insight. Yeah, it's not one or the other. It's that you bring together these two things that are sort of contradictory. Structure and no agenda, linear and non-linear. It's like always bringing these things together that don't naturally seem to go together. So you're in charge of the linear stuff.
It's a deal, William. All right, let's end the interview here.
Thank you. This all starts with self-awareness, right? So you need to start by understanding your own nature, understanding your own talents, your own principles, your own beliefs, your own priorities, your purpose, your mission, what your skills are, what you're wired to do, what game you're equipped to succeed at. Then you have to find the right paths that are consistent with it.